Thank you. Good afternoon to all the viewers of this short course on geoinformatics for biodiversity conservation planning. I welcome all of you. I am Hitendra Padalia, and I am the head of the Forestry and Ecology Department at Indian Institute of Remote Sensing, Dehradun. Today, this is the first lecture of this particular course. So let me first give you the brief background of this course. What is the content of this course? So basically in this course, we are going to cover different topics, and first talk will be delivered by me today on application of GIS in biodiversity conservation planning. And then next talk will be on fine scale mapping of vegetation using machine learning by Dr. Iswaridat Rai. Then 3D characterization of forest biodiversity. This lecture will be delivered by Dr. Subrat Nandi. And then there will be another lecture on functional biodiversity assessment using geoinformatics by Dr. Taibang Botham. Another lecture will be on wildlife habitat suitability assessment using geoinformatics by Dr. Subrata Nandi. And then one demo cum lecture will be on cloud computing for forest monitoring. That will be taken by Mr. Ashish Best. And finally, the last lecture will be on bioinformatics and wildlife telemetry by Dr. Samir Saran. So these many lectures basically we have scheduled in 2 weeks of time. We are supported by our distance learning program team headed by Dr. Harish Chand Karnataka, and then we have the course program coordinator Dr. Poonam Seth madam, and then we have Sri Ashok Gildia and Sri Janardhan Vishwakarmaji. So they are providing all technical support for the execution of this particular course. Now coming to my lecture, the first lecture is on application of GIS for biodiversity conservation planning. And I understand that in the today's lecture, there are participants from different backgrounds as well as of different level of educations. Let me first give you a brief definition. It's very important because when we are talking about biodiversity, you should have an understanding of this. What is biodiversity? So we define biodiversity as the variability and variety of life on the earth, and this is the diverse definition which is more oftenly used. But if you have to really understand the different level of organization of biodiversity, because biodiversity is a multi-scale concept, then biodiversity is a measure of variation at genetic, species, ecosystem level, landscape level, biome level. So there are different levels of organization of biodiversity, whether it on the planet Earth. Basically, you know, the plant diversity, particularly, its manifestation is from gene to species to population to community to ecosystem to landscape to biome, and there are a lot of variability is there in among the plant, and then there is another diversity of animals. So you are aware that why we are interested in biodiversity conservation planning. That is, I think no need to emphasize here. Biodiversity is very much needed for the survival of this particular life on this particular planet. So for the stability of the life and for the continuity of the life on this planet, biodiversity conservation and its sustainable use is of paramount importance. Now, there are different ways of conserving biodiversity. There are in situ or ex situ ways of conserving the biodiversity. And in situ means that you conserve biodiversity at the place where it exists. So this is the most practical way of conserving biodiversity. And another way is ex situ conservation, where you particularly you focus on rare, endangered, and threatened plant species, and you particularly conserve them in botanical gardens or arborea like things. So these are the two broad approaches for biodiversity conservation. Now the things comes why we are so worried about this particular aspect of conservation of biodiversity. So you are all aware that globally researchers or policymakers, governments, they actually brought the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, and at the time it was the different governments committed to conservation of biodiversity because biodiversity loss was happening at a very rapid rate. And now there is, more than 3 decade time is about to pass. And what is the status today? So today the status is much more worrying, especially the report, one report which came in 2019, that is brought by International Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Resources. So this is just like you can understand that there is one report brought by IPCC on understanding the physical basis of climate and climate change. Similarly, there is another body, this IPBS. This has brought for the first time a very comprehensive assessment about what is the status of biodiversity, whether it's plants, whether it's animals. And so these pictures I have taken from their report, and it shows that that on one axis you see that there are different groups of species are there. Another axis, the total number of species so far estimated for or inventorized from the wild, and then the what is the level of threat on this particular group of species. So from this picture, it's very clear that you can see that IUCN has made different categories for understanding the threat status or the impact of anthropogenic pressures on the survival of the species. And you can see that wherever you see the color in orange and pink and red color, so those indicates there is a higher degree of threats on those groups like corals, conifers, dicots, amphibians, cycads. So this picture shows that at present globally biodiversity loss is happening at a very alarming rate, and there are reasons for that why these things is happening. We know that country like India and other developing countries, those who have a major chunk of habitat of these species, they are developing and their population is growing, economies are growing. So because of that, there is a lot of pressure on the wildlife habitat, and as well as there are many other factors like wildlife trafficking is happening across the countries, and because of that, there are many species have come to a very small number. Now, what are the major driver? If you go to that report, refer to that report, you will find a very updated information. What are the major driver of biodiversity change on this particular planet today? But in general, you can understand from this slide that one of the most important driver of change on the terrestrial surface is the land use changes. And you know that humans have modified the surface, and it is deforestation rates were very high about 4 or 5 decades back, but still in many countries these rates are still very high, and habitat loss is happening. And this is not only the habitat have been reduced in size, but also they have become patchy and they are fragmented. So this actually is causing major cause of loss in the habitat of these species. And then climate change is another aspects which have been appreciated recently in last 2 decades that, and recent meeting also in Glasgow, and then the assessment report which has come, AR6 assessment report, that shows that there is a climate change has a very significant negative impact on the biodiversity, whether it is the ecosystem or it is different types of habitats or it is the species. All are getting impacted by the climate change activities. And then there are other factors like nitrogen deposition and impact of invasive species, particularly of the plants and also of the animals. They are causing changes in the biodiversity in their invaded areas. So these are the major driver which actually are impacting biodiversity, and we have to understand their impact, and in coming time all these things are going to further increase. Land use change activities is not going to stop, it's going to increase. Climate change, by today's projection, the rate at which the emission of carbon dioxide gases or greenhouse gases is taking place, it's going to further increase. And nitrogen deposition, similarly biotic exchange or invasion of the plant species, all these drivers are going to be more and more dominant and will have a more negative impact on biodiversity. Now, so this is the scenario, but what initially was thought in the beginning when the conservationists were trying to actually suggest approaches for biodiversity conservation, at the time they proposed the hotspot approach in 1990s, and one of the very seminal paper by Mayer, he identified, he was working with Conservation International. It is a intergovernmental NGO, non-governmental organization, which works internationally. And he proposed that there are 25 places across the globe which are very exceptional in terms of their endemicity of plants, or also they are facing immense pressure from habitat loss. So he identified 25 such hotspots. So this is the first, you can understand, this is geographic approach towards planning for biodiversity conservation. And why they have identified this hotspot, basically the idea was that to wherever these hotspots are there, those countries and those governments and the managers of those places, they should be given enough funds and technical capacity to conserve the biodiversity. The basic idea was that. Now, there could be another approach also, like if you have to make choices between conserving genetic diversity and species diversity. You know, country like India have a lot of very high plant biodiversity, for example, and similarly there is a high genetic diversity also. So always when you, as a decision maker, sitting in a ministry which deals with the conservation of the nature and the species in a particular country, you have to prioritize always that which are the areas which are rich in both genetic as well as species diversity, which are those areas where only genetic diversity is very high, or which are those areas where already genetic diversity and species diversity is facing maximum erosions due to the human influence. So you have to prioritize the habitat accordingly. So this is one of the way we can think of prioritizing certain places above other places in terms of their attributes, whether it's genetic attributes, whether they are species attributes, or whether there are other unique attributes of ecosystem, because some of the ecosystem are very unique. For example, Kaziranga National Parks in Assam, it's very unique for having one horn unique on this particular rhinoceros species. So there are such places also where unique species exist. So we always have a very multi-pronged approach for actually prioritizing certain things, because prioritization is, as I said, is important for funding for providing technical capacities to the managers, those who are on the ground working for conservation, and also for highlighting these areas, the importance of such areas to the masses. Now, how geographic information system comes into picture, because geographic data means any feature which is having lat-long information, as well as it has a associated attribute information. And biodiversity fits into this, because biodiversity across globe is not evenly distributed, it's unevenly distributed. Some of the places are very rich in biodiversity like equators, and some of the places are very poor in terms of species like at polar region. And similarly, then they are at smaller and regional scale also, there are a lot of variation. So from species diversity to community diversity to population to landscape, it has a geographic context and it has a attribute information attached to it. So that's why GIS has a very, very important role. It's only up to the imagination of the user. He can drive a number of applications using GIS. But why GIS is required? You need to understand that GIS has several functionalities. Like GIS, first of all, it can help you in archival of the data, whether you have a biodiversity map of a particular area or you have plot inventory data. Both the kind of data can be stored in GIS. It can be analyzed applying certain rules, certain methods in the GIS platform itself, and it can link the features with the attribute information also in a variety of ways. And finally, it also helps in visualization of the data, like different kind of data, whether you want to see the plot data, whether you want to see the spatial distribution of the plots. So this way it helps. Then comes you can add a number of different themes in GIS for integrated analysis. So the most important feature of GIS is the integrated analysis, because ecosystems are integrated. Ecosystem has biotic component, abiotic component, energy flow, so many aspects in the ecosystem. So if you want to understand an ecosystem and if you have to manage or plan for biodiversity, you have to understand different aspects of that ecosystem. And in that sense, GIS can integrate information on all such aspects of the ecosystem in a very, very cohesive manner, and then it can help you in decision making. Finally, why we use GIS is to have decision making, effective decision making based on scientific data and databases, and also to generate certain projection, future projection based on these data and the trends of the data. So it gives you answer where is the biodiversity located, what is the condition of biodiversity, for example, what is the trend of deforestation over the time, what is the pattern of deforestation, and then modeling, as I said, because biodiversity, some aspect of biodiversity can be directly sensed using remote sensing also. That I will talk a little bit later. Like if you have to make vegetation type map, it can be directly done with remote sensing. But there are other aspects, like there are certain plants like lichens, like mosses, like understory plants, they cannot be directly viewed by the remote sensing. So you need to have modeling approaches. So that's why GIS has variety of modeling approaches embedded in it, and based on which it helps us in generating different prediction as well as different future scenarios for decision making. So ultimately, you should understand that everything is for making a very effective decision, where how to prioritize, where to prioritize biodiversity. To have such kind of decision, you need GIS. Then now what has happened that GIS, the strength of the GIS has increased. Why? Because there are multiple sources or multiple instruments by which we can collect geographic data. For example, this picture shows a very perfect example for the conservationist like us. We are working with these technologies, like we have satellite technologies, which are providing continuous coverage some providing daytime coverage, some even nighttime coverage also with radar, and they are providing daily basis to weekly to monthly basis information. So that is a one kind of monitoring system placed very high in the Earth orbit for monitoring biodiversity. You need not to worry about satellite. Once placed, they will do their job, but you should have good sensor over there, and then they will repeatedly collect the data, and the data will be stored at some place, at some Earth station or data dissemination center, and you can acquire, you have a flexibility to acquire the data anytime for analysis. Another kind of instrumentation is the aircraft, and now more common is unmanned aerial vehicle. And these type of instruments are UAV type of instruments are very handy because they having capability to do proximal remote sensing. They can go close to that object, and that's why they can locate very fine detail in the forest canopy, in forest gaps, and in those areas where inaccessibility is there, and they can also provide information when satellite pass is not there. So different kind of data, very high resolution data, monitoring can be done more efficiently with drone. And then there are ground-based sensors which supplements the satellite data or the other kind of data, thematic maps, which normally the conservationist or botanist or ecologist use, such as the topographic sheets and such as the soil map and other map. And so this type of ground-based instrumentation, like some are being used for wildlife monitoring, like camera traps for tiger population monitoring. Sound recorders is used by bird watchers. Similarly, now satellite telemetry is coming in a big way with the miniaturization of the satellite tags. Now satellite can also provide you continuous coverage on certain animal movements. So this type of data is now getting integrated into GIS, and it is giving a lot of geographic data from different places in a continuous basis. And in addition that citizen science, you can see that you can, with your mobile phone now, you can collect a lot of such information which can be very useful in decision making using GIS. Now coming to remote sensing. Remote sensing is one of the major source of data for GIS, particularly for biodiversity conservation planning. Remote sensing data are available at different resolution, coarse resolution, moderate resolution, high resolution, at different spatial resolution. You can see from this slide. And then at what scale these resolutions are used, it's indicated, like very coarse resolution can be used for monitoring large scale processes or biome level mapping or locating large areas. And then moderate level resolution, 30-20 meter, can be used to map the habitats which are like vegetation type map. And third level, very high resolution, can be used for conditional monitoring, like if you are interested in monitoring the stock condition of a forest or canopy cover status of a forest, then very high resolution data, or further very high resolution data now which has come better than 5 meter spatial resolution. That kind of data is very useful for monitoring purposes at a local scale. Now these are the active remote sensing technologies. What I have talked, optical, working in optical domain, but there are other technologies like laser and hyperspectral, and similarly microwave remote sensing are there. Hyperspectral is of course in optical domain only, but hyperspectral has another advantage, that it gives you additional sensitivity to the foliar chemistry or the foliar chemical constituents, leaf chemical constituents. That's why it can enhance the information what is being provided by the optical, particularly the multispectral remote sensing, and it can facilitate better discrimination of species, communities, and the traits, several chemical traits of the canopy, moisture conditions, and pigments, etc. Another aspect is LiDAR remote sensing is there. LiDAR basically is the active sensor and sensitive to the structure of the object. In our case, it's very sensitive to the forest canopy height and structure, like what is the layering of the different layering in the forest canopy. Now on these aspects later you will have a separate lecture later on. Similarly, on high resolution remote sensing you will have a lecture, so you will be able to understand how different remote sensing data sets are useful for deriving different level of information on biodiversity. Ultimately, all this information which is being derived based on these different optical, laser, hyperspectral data, they will be integrated into GIS. Now, I'm just giving you one example. I'm not covering different kinds of studies what are being done using GIS for biodiversity. I have selected one or two case studies, but my idea is to give you an understanding how GIS can be applied to a particular problem. I will focus on more on that. So the first problem is that you have to describe the scale at which you want to do a particular GIS application. Scale is very important, particularly because in a geographical context, scale varies. For example, if you are trying to understand the habitat condition of elephant versus a small squirrel, for example, so their activity area and their habitat requirement is quite different. So that's why they operate at different spatial scale. So you have to understand these things, and accordingly you have to hypothesize the kind of methods, the kind of analysis you are going to conduct. For example, elephants, they are long-ranging animals, thousands of kilometers they can move. So obviously, even coarse resolution satellite data can meet your requirement of preparing a broad zonation of vegetation or vegetation cover on which elephants is dependent. But for a very small squirrel kind of thing, you have to take very high resolution satellite data in order to highlight the micro variability of a very small place, which is the landscape for this particular animal. Now, in landscape, for example, one thing here I would like to stress upon that you see in biodiversity conservation, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we are mainly focusing on in situ conservation. In situ conservation, when we talk about, then in our context, protected areas, particularly the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and the conservation reserve, community reserve, these all are the instruments. These are all are the ways by which we do the in situ conservation. Now, they are based on landscape approach or ecosystem approach. The idea is basically we have so much of diversity, that so much of richness in the species, and that we cannot focus on one species. Rather, that will be very, very costly to develop program for all the species of concern. So the idea is, if you have, if you can select some areas, some geographic areas, and identify them, and then put them under some kind of protection, whether national parks, sanctuaries, community reserve, conservation reserve. So it will help us in enforcement of the law, and in making the regular monitoring of those areas, and also ensuring the conservation of those areas. And this will help in conserving not only one species but entire ecosystem. So that's why when we talk of in terms of applying remote sensing, so mainly remote sensing or GIS, in this context we talk about ex situ conservation and doing planning for biodiversity conservation or ex situ conservation. Now, so one of the problem was that when that in country like ours, we have dedicated organizations like Botanical Survey of India, Geological Survey of India. They do the inventorization of the plant species. They report new species. They publish list. They update list. They do survey in different part of the country. That is their mandate. But no spatial representation of biodiversity comes. So from their data, because the data is not been put into GIS platform. So what has happened that in late around 1997 or 2000 time, at the time it was realized that whether it is possible to generate a spatial representation of biodiversity or plant diversity for the entire country, where there are high concentration of plants species, which are those areas where they are having moderate level and lower level of plant diversity. So this was basically a kind of hypothesis was there that all over India, biodiversity is not evenly distributed, and some are very rich, some are moderate level, and some are lower level. Now the problem was how to model it. If we say that we want to model the plant richness or plant diversity or biological diversity, how to model it? So basically this triangle, you can understand there are three triangles, they are crossing each other. So they constitute, one is constituting the habitat, where you can talk about vegetation type, species diversity, ecosystem uniqueness. And then another triangle is about environmental complexity, that explain the what kind of terrain it is. Like Himalaya is very rugged terrain, what kind of climate, it's a temperate climate, and landform, it's mountainous landscape. So it is a very different, Himalaya is very different than the central India. Similarly, disturbance regime, the human disturbance regime, particularly the the roads, the settlements, and the human dependency on forest is high in those areas. Which areas? Where human population is more. Like nobody can expect very high disturbance in high altitude Himalaya, where population is very small. So obviously where human pressure, cattle pressure is high, those areas will be having a high human disturbance. And so if you cross all these things, disturbance and the habitat and the species diversity of that area and environmental complexity, then you can identify an area which can be prioritized. It can be prioritized for conservation. So this is how in GIS, anytime whenever you try to develop a particular application, you think of, first you should have a background of ecology, you should have background of, you should have understanding of biodiversity, you should have some understanding of other aspects of biodiversity, like how it relates to soil, how it relates to geology, how it relates to disturbance, how it relates to climate. So if you have this kind of understanding, then you can draw such kind of sketch, rough sketch in your, so that you can further refine these things to put them in perspective. GIS will come later on. First, you have to make in your thinking that this way I will identify the richness of priority zone. So this type of GIS analysis, you have to done in the multi-layer operation, where disturbance is one layer, habitat is another layer, environmental complexity is another layer. When you cross them, all three layers, that your priority zone for biodiversity conservation will be identified. So now, so based on this approach, what can be done? Like for example, if when we talk of biodiversity conservation planning, the first and foremost thing is that you have to have a very accurate and very detailed information on vegetation types. Okay, because if we are talking about wilderness areas or natural areas, so definitely the first thing is that the basic map which is required is the vegetation type map. And in satellite remote sensing, now earlier there was less option, but now there are plenty of options that from different satellites, Sentinel, Landsat, IIRS series of satellites, you can get data freely available, and you have a flexibility to generate a detailed vegetation type map of your area. And you don't have the problem which was faced earlier, like cloud in the satellite data. Now cloud-free satellite data is available. Then you also consider topographic information that also is available from satellite, like digital elevation models. Satellite can provide, some provide from radar interferometry, and some provide through stereo data. And then comes the biogeographical zonation. This is also very important. because country we have different climatic zones, and in different climatic zones we have very unique relationship between climates, fauna and flora. So that's why the understanding of biogeography is also very important if you have to really make a good classification scheme and you attempt to classify a vegetation type map of a particular area. And then of course you need ground truth, and based on which you prepare a vegetation type map. And then further characterization of vegetation type, for example, for biodiversity conservation is very important. It's not only map is enough. You need to know what is contained within each class of vegetation which has been identified through mapping. What is there within that, whether what kind of plants are there, what kind of animal, both way you can do. So for example, in this case you can see that in one of the picture here it shows that the distribution of the sample plots which has been laid out across the country by a very large number of scientists and researchers were there in this project. And then in different, this particular graph shows that how many species of plants were encountered into different vegetation type or different region of the country. Now this type of approach you can adopt, and you can always when you plan for for making a biodiversity conservation planning for a particular region, you first decide that what is the total ecological region, which should have some ecological identity. It should not be that you select certain district or certain arbitrarily administrative boundary, but rather select boundaries based on the ecological boundaries and such as the biogeographical provinces, so that what will happen, it will be considered as a ecological entity, and it will have certain uniformity in patterns over there, like the vegetation type will get repeated over there, and plant species will get repeated over several places. So you can then it will give you a better analysis, not only with satellite data but also when you will analyze the plot data. So this type of thought process should be there when you plan for collecting field data and selecting area, and then laying out sample plot in the field, and then developing the database for integrating with the GIS. And you can prepare database for different components of biodiversity, whether tree, herbs, shrubs, climbers, even for lower forms of plants or lower forms of animals. You can prepare the database, a detailed database, also on their level of conservation status. You can prepare the database, and then you can link this data with the vegetation type maps or detailed vegetation type map which you have prepared in the first step. So this way, suppose this is the kind of representation in our country is there as far as the vegetation types are distribution is concerned. So this is the one level of exercise from the national project which has come up, but at local level you can further refine it, because now data is improving and you can further improve it, and you can add more number of classes. So based on your own field knowledge, now you can see there are a lot of classes have been identified in this particular vegetation type map, because one vegetation type map which was earlier prepared by Champion and Said, because he is considered to be the pioneer in forest classification in India, and they prepared a broad forest type map for the country. But after that, when satellite remote sensing data was used, so these maps has been generated, and this is a very detailed map, but still there are local variation in the vegetation type with disturbance. Vegetation type also doesn't remain fixed. Their boundaries changes with time over time, so changes also keeps on happening. And so that's why for your purpose you can use this data. We have this data, you can inquire from us, we can provide you. But the thing is that you need to prepare such kind of detailed vegetation type map for any biodiversity conservation planning. Now the things comes how to analyze this further, how to in GIS what can we do. So this is one example I'm showing you what is possible if you have a detailed plant species database, you have a detailed vegetation type map. What is next? So in this case, for example, you have as I talked about ex situ conservation. So landscape ecology is one branch which is very practical in and it has a very practical value for conservation of species and ecosystem. And this evolved in Germany, and this term landscape ecology was given by Karl Troll, and now it focuses on three aspects. One is on structure, function, and then change. So what is the spatial relationship between different ecosystems, and what is the interaction different spatial element, and how these structure and function changes over time. So let me just give you an example that these are the software, Fragstats and Patch Analyst, and similarly there are other software which are not in public domain, but they provide you the option to actually ingest the vegetation type map which you have prepared into these packages, and then they have matrices. They can compute different characteristics of the landscape, such as patch density, edge density, porosity, patch size, largest patch size. So there are n number of such matrices are there. More than 50 such matrices are there. Now it depends on your background knowledge and your understanding of the area, understanding of the problem of species, or literature is already there. You can select the optimal matrices to be used in your analysis. Now, similar attempt has been done here, for example, because here the objective was to first identify biological rich areas. So, arrive at biological rich areas, you basically, I told you that a triangle, 3 circles I showed you. So, in those circles, first what is required is that, vegetation type map we prepared, okay, and this is all GIS, okay, and then based on, you make the area divide into forest, non-forest. Based on that, you have fragmentation indices, you compute the level of fragmentation, the isolation of the patches. Similarly, you can take road settlements and you can make buffer proximity analysis. This is another very important tool in GIS. And then you can generate some matrices like porosity, interspersion, juxtaposition. They all actually characterize the pattern of the landscape, the distribution of the different patches of different vegetation type in the area. And then this information can be integrated as a disturbance index. So what is the disturbance index means? For example, it could be a function of fragmentation, porosity, interspersion, or the human disturbance. So you have to think like this, that you have to generate a function which will characterize the disturbance. Then in next step, basically you have collected field data. So from field data, that field data also you have to link to the each vegetation type, and then not only the number of species or diversity index you can calculate for different vegetation type, but also you can collect some data on economic uses of the plants, and you can attach the economic value to each vegetation type. And similarly, in each vegetation type, if there is certain unique species, for example, which is a very rare species or an endemic species, that type of information in GIS you can attach to a particular vegetation type. So on basis of these, you can actually, if there are 4 or 5 different vegetation types in an area, you can always prioritize them one over another in terms of their richness, in terms of their endemicity, in terms of their economic value. And then similarly, one another thing, terrain complexity I talked to, in our country also this situation is there, wherever we have very rugged terrain, very high complex terrain. For example, Western Ghats and Northeast India, you have high biodiversity because humans had low access to those areas. So this type of terrain complexity image also you can generate using digital elevation model. And then you can, all these things again you can use to define a biological richness. That could be a function of ecosystem, unique element of ecosystem, the richness of different vegetation type, the economic value of different vegetation type, terrain complexity, and then finally this disturbance. So this way basically you can arrive by multi-criteria analysis in GIS platform, you can always generate a very value-added product, what I should say, because biological richness has different aspects. It's up to you how you hypothesize, the generation of this biological richness. You can add another aspects also into this, but in this particular aspect project, things has been done. So based on that, there are different maps, intermediate maps have been generated. Like this is the disturbance map. This is the first one, this fragmentation status of the different vegetation type across country. Then you have the disturbance status. Disturbance means in terms of low, medium, high, very high disturbance. It's a qualitative term. So that way you can always prepare this type of representation of the disturbance, human disturbance to the biologically, the biodiversity across the country. And then finally, biological richness, which I was mentioning in the particular flow chart. So this map will come, and in this map, now you know what has been used in preparation of this map. There have been different level of information has been integrated, and finally you see that use of GIS has helped us in generation of this particular map, which based on which now you can actually think of many applications. But particularly our purpose is that we wanted to understand what is the distribution of biodiversity across the country, where it is more diversity is concentrated, where there's less diversity is there. Because now when we overlay protected areas, now ex situ conservation tools, we have protected areas, I told you, and there are other conservation categories. If you overlay on these maps, then you will get a understanding that where we have actually, where we on our conservation planning, where we have left out certain rich areas out of our protected areas, and what should we do actually, even if we don't have flexibility to make new protected areas, whether we can make those areas ecologically sensitive areas, or we can encourage the communities to take care of those areas if the government, the forest department doesn't have a control of protecting those areas. So these sort of things are possible when you have a map. Now another thing is, so this was a native species, all native species data which has been integrated, and the native biological richness of the country has been represented. Now if I want to understand another aspect, like I told that there are many exotic plant species in the country today, they are spreading at a very faster rate. So those can be called as the invasive plants. Now in invasive plants also there are large in number, because in our survey there were around 150, more than 150 such plant species we encountered, which are not having origin from India, but they have come to India from different ways. But now today they are spreading, and they are causing actually damage to the natural regeneration of the tree species as well as other biodiversity. So there is another approach, is ecological niche modeling, in which actually if you can relate the species occurrence with the climatic requirement of the species primarily, and other topographic requirement of that particular species, you can generate the basically potential distribution map of particular species. But when you have large number of species, like in this case we are having more than 65 such species, one out of 111 species we selected, and we integrated the suitability map, you can say, or susceptibility map of 111 species for entire country, and made this particular product. And in this product now there are areas where there are hotspots has been identified, means which will be the areas where maximum number of exotic alien species will invade in future. So from this analysis, what we have found that Central India, particularly where we have very large population of wild herbivores and grasslands, protected areas, this area will be highly threatened by a range of exotic invasive plant species. So now you have another map which you have prepared based on ecological niche modeling. The earlier exercise which I showed you based on multi-criteria analysis for native biodiversity, and this exercise we generate hotspot map for invasive plant species using ecological niche modeling. And when we integrate these two, for example, this is a Central India, and here when we integrate these two type of information, one is native biodiversity and what is plant species, they are invading the particular ecosystem. And when you cross these two maps, then you can actually understand that where there is a greater risk of invasive plants or a set of invasive plants on the native biodiversity. So this way you can further prioritize which system, like the red areas shown here in these maps, they have high priority because they contain more richness and they have higher threats from invasive species. So this way spatial planning can be done by relating two types of data sets on biodiversity. One is native biodiversity and one is exotic biodiversity, which is harmful to the native species and ecosystem. Then it's just extension of this. I am showing that, for example, a case of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. You can see that from this map that Andaman, though area is very small, something around 8,000 square kilometer, but you see how many number of protected areas have been designated there. There are in total 99 wildlife sanctuaries and 7 national parks. And you will be surprised to see that the main part of these islands, you won't see large protected areas. Only the small islands which are lying outside the mainland area, they have been declared as the protected area. So this has been done long back. The idea was basically, it seems that the idea was to keep the main revenue generating areas, the forest areas, outside the protected area. But small islands, even they were not having name also, they have been declared as a protected area based on presence of flexible species. But it was not a very rational protected area planning. Now, if today somebody say that, okay, let us see at this protected area network whether it is really effective in conserving biodiversity of this particular Andaman and Nicobar Islands, then you have to really see the maps which have been prepared, like the vegetation type map you can see which prepared. What are the distribution of different habitat type? When you overlay these protected area boundary on this, then you will came to know that how much is represented within the protected areas. Whether that is sufficient, globally it has been said that at least 15% of the habitat should be inside the protected area. But whether in this case, whether this much area is there or not, or it's lagging behind. Now, similarly, another map, for example, because it is a coastal region, so in coast you have corals, you have mud flats, you have rocky outcrops, rocky coast, so they form habitats of different marine animals, along the coast. So these maps also has been generated based on satellite remote sensing only. And then over this, if you can identify certain things, for example, turtles. So turtles are one kind of focal species in marine ecosystem, and they move across these islands in different beaches for nesting. And if their movement is there over the time, it means the ecosystem is functioning well. But if they stop coming to particular islands and particular beach, then it will not be considered as a good sign for the biodiversity, because they are the indicator species also. So if you can actually, because there were surveys were there, or reports were there, but the beach name was mentioned there, but nobody had put the information which was lying in the other, not in a map form, over the maps. So this is also one thing I want to stress upon here. Biodiversity information is always not in the form of a map. So you have to think how you can overlay the such type of very special information from literature or from published sources on the maps, and then see how it is distributed. Similarly, we overlaid the plant important bird areas. So this is another kind of information it was lying somewhere else. So these black dot you can see here, they have been actually the bird congregation areas. And when you overlay these on this map, then you can understand holistically that what is the status of the turtle, what is the status of the coastal habitat, what is the status of the bird rich areas rich in bird population and vegetation type, and this is the biological richness map. So then you can take a proper decision that what are the gaps actually in representation of the biodiversity in the protected areas, and what can be done actually to rationalize the boundaries of the protected areas. Or if national parks and wildlife sanctuaries are not covering enough area, whether it is possible to declare community reserve, conservation reserve, where you think that there are certain species which needs immediate conservation attention. Then finally, the GIS important functionality of GIS is to store the information. And for this, you need to actually, whatever data you collect, you just organize it in a particular format. Or if you are not doing it your own, at least you can contact those who are managing the biodiversity. They have templates. So you can actually prepare the database according to that template and donate your database to those portals, so that if the data will remain there for a longer time period of time. And anybody, your data can have a flexibility to integrate with the data shared by other groups. And this way, actually, the data can come from multiple sources to one platform, and then the public can visualize this, or the managers, those who want to take decision, they can visualize this information. And one such attempt is this Indian Bioresource Information Network. So multiple organizations have given their database here, and now there is flexibility that, for example, I can overlay my plant species database on the forest cover map of the Forest Survey of India. So this kind of actually technology allows this web GIS, we call it, it allows this functionality that data can be shared among the researchers in a predefined template where data will be systematically stored, and following certain international convention or criteria, data can be compared across the regions in a seamless manner, and no duplication of the data will be there. Authentication of the data will be there, such as the name of the plants, name of the animals, they will be correct. So all these things, these portals, when data is stored in a web GIS platform or database system, it helps in maintaining data for a biodiversity conservation, for good planning, good biodiversity conservation planning. So these are some of the things I further how this database has been used by different agencies in the country or is being used in different reports. Then a further extension of this, because one project currently for alpine region of the Himalaya is undergoing. Now in this attempt, now next level of biodiversity information, community level of plants. So far, the GIS database has been prepared for vegetation type level. So whether there is a possibility to use very fine resolution or high resolution satellite data for inventorizing the alpine biodiversity, which is the biodiversity occur at a very higher altitude above 2800 meter elevation, particularly in Himalayan region, and which are inaccessible, but they are very diverse at a community level and fine scale level. So whether satellite data can provide what we have done previously, whether the new data can give you additional information. So those things now going on, and in this actually now detail mapping is been going on, and in GIS platform again with more fine characterization of biodiversity, and then also the drone, whether drone can help us in basically in the survey, in plant species or animal survey, because those inaccessible region, it is very difficult to sometimes locate or approach the slopes where plants populations is growing, and that may be endangered plant or rare plant, but it will be difficult for the field researcher to climb on those slopes. But UAV can really facilitate this in a very systematic manner. It can help in analyzing those slopes. So there is an attempt is going on whether how this technology, new technology, can help in generating the fine scale biodiversity data. So with this, actually, I have come to the end of my presentation. So my basic idea was to give you a case, to demonstrate to you a case where from the basics, defining the problem. What is the problem? The problem was how to prioritize biodiversity at country level for conservation planning. Then how the tools should be used, whether it's remote sensing, whether it is GIS, how plant inventory should be done, how vegetation type map can be prepared, how in approach, ecological concepts like landscape ecology concept, how they can be incorporated to our methodology, and then how we can actually, for conservation planning, how we can overlay this information, superimpose the information in the protected area network system, and then find out the gaps. Where are the gaps? Which in these gaps need to be filled up for biodiversity conservation. So then finally, what is the utility of the databases or web GIS in actually helping the biodiversity conservation planning? So with this, I end my presentation here.